What we're doing this year is talking about just the Gospels. So, for some of you who were with me last year, and some of you who've been doing this class for many years, some of this stuff that, especially that we're going to talk about tonight, may feel a little bit repetitive, but it's always a good reminder. And you all know that I always go to Josh for reminders. Josh, for those of you who don't know, my husband Joshua Yoder is a New Testament scholar, so he's always helpful to me, and I think it probably actually makes me a little lazy, and I try to not remember things that I know he can always remind me of. So, it's just good to have these kinds of reminders together. So we're going to be doing all this year looking at the Gospels from scratch. So when we use that phrase from scratch, it means that every time we get together, I'm going to start with some real basics for anybody maybe who feels like they're kind of coming at this as a novice. Too often in the church, we kind of start, with Bible 301 instead of Bible 101 and just assume everybody knows what we're talking about. And so always in this place, this is a place where we kind of start from the beginning and talk about basics, but especially because you are adult learners, we don't get afraid to jump to Bible 501 if we need to and talk about some complex things, because all of us have in some ways complex relationships with scripture. And so sometimes we do some basics and sometimes we have some pretty deep or complicated conversations. So we do both, but we always start from the beginning. So I wanted to start with this picture because I almost never get to use it because the copy of it that I have is just about 4 inches by 4 inches. And so it doesn't work well in the classroom, but I could scan it and show it to you today. So this is actually an image 20 years ago. The National Catholic Reporter, which is a sort of independent publication for the Catholic Church, did a thing called the Jesus 2000 competition. And in that process, they asked artists to create a new image of Jesus for the 21st century. And so this is not the winner. Maybe we'll do another class where I'll show you the winner, but this is not the winner. This was one of the finalists in the competition, and I always really have loved it because when you really look at it right closely, and feel free to get your face as close to the screen as you need to to look at it, you can see that within this kind of silhouette of the face of Jesus are sort of vignettes from all the stories of the Gospels. So you can see at the top what looks like the Last Supper. You can see all the way kind of where his chin is. Clearly this is the story of the wedding at Cana. If you go up along his right-hand cheek, you can see the parable of the Good Samaritan. You can see Jesus healing the man that he's putting the mud on his eyes. I could look at this picture for a while and just look for all these sort of different vignettes from the life of Jesus and from the stories of the Gospels. So I wanted to start us out with this image as we think about what does it mean to study the Gospels and really what is a gospel. So I can email that picture out to folks if you want a copy of it so you can look at it closely. So when we talk about a gospel, we're really talking about 3 different things, or we can think about it in 3 different ways. And so at its very kind of essence, the gospel is a story of the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, who lived in Palestine in the 1st century, right? And so there are gospels that do exactly that aren't included in our Bible. But this is when we say a gospel, that's what we're talking about, sort of this narrative, this historical telling of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But the gospel, the word God, we use the word gospel in another way as well, right? To signify good news. So the gospel is also this good news, this truth that because of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who we believe is God incarnate, that we are welcomed into a new, renewed relationship with God, our Creator, through Christ. So, gospel is also good news. So, sometimes in worship, you'll hear us say, the truth of the gospel is this. Because Christ died, we have been saved. So, we use gospel in that way as well. But then we also talk about the Gospels as a way, because we are a part of a faith that says, here is our sort of emblem of the faith. We are disciples of this teacher. And so the Gospels tell the story of the disciples and what it means, how to follow him and how to walk in his footsteps, right? That Christianity is very much about saying, Jesus showed us as flawed human beings what our potential is as human beings. And so we read the Gospels so that we know how to behave and how to live as Christians. So the Gospels are also kind of like a roadmap or a kind of guide for us as Christians living in the world today. So anytime we read a story from the Gospels, we kind of, in any given story, take all three of those things together, right? So when we read a story, we pay attention to the history of it and the way that this author is telling the story. We pay attention to the theological message that is trying to be sent. What does this teach us about our relationship with God? What is the identity of Jesus that is trying to be conveyed in this story? And then the sort of, what is the practical piece to this? How does this story or passage from the Gospels teach us how to be Christians or followers of Christ? So one example that you could use for that that fits well with these three things would be the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Right? So this is a fairly common story. It occurs in more than one gospel, and we're going to get into in just a minute the why we have four different gospels. But so the story of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus has been teaching out in the world and in the community, and thousands of people have gathered to hear him teach, and he teaches for so long that it gets to the point where it's time to eat. And the disciples, come to Jesus and say, hey, people are hungry and we're the ones that brought them here. And so we need to either send them away or figure out how to feed them. Or you need to send them away, right? They say to Jesus, we need to send these people away. And Jesus says, no, you need to feed them. And the disciples say, are you kidding me? Right? We don't have enough to feed them. We can't do this. And Jesus, encourages them to try to feed these people with what they have. And so the story is told differently in different places, but it turns out that, from a small amount of food, a few loaves and a few fish, that all the people, the thousands who are gathered there, are all fed, and there's more than enough left over, right? So this is the story that we, some of us learned as children. We love to preach on this story as well in worship. So when we read a story like that, we're looking at the sort of historical, maybe if I was preaching on that story, I would say, oh, well, a common thing that we say when we talk about the feeding of the 5,000 is it's probably even more than that, because we know in the first century, they wouldn't even have counted women and children. So this is a bigger group than even 5,000. And we talk about, sort of the cultural aspects to the story and the way that the story is even told, the dialogue between Jesus and his disciples. But then when we read a story like that, we also talk about, well, what does it mean that we believe that Jesus performed miracles, right? And so what is the sort of theological essence of this? What does it mean to believe that, Jesus was able to miraculously create more food than was actually present there? And what was that miracle supposed to mean to the first readers? And what does it mean to us today? And then we can also read a story like the feeding of 5,000 and say, okay, well, what does that mean for us as Christian disciples? To say, one of Jesus' most impactful miracles was that he fed hungry people. And so, what is our relationship as followers of Christ to feeding people and practicing hospitality and generosity and those kinds of things? So, you can take all of these different aspects and kind of bring them together when we read these different stories. And that's what we'll do throughout this year. Now, I promise you, some stories are going to be heavy on theology and low on praxis, right? Sometimes you read a story and go, that's great, but that doesn't mean anything to me today, right? Or we can read a story that has a lot of really complex cultural pieces to it and historical pieces that we say, well, that doesn't really help me understand who Jesus is as, the second person of the Trinity. So sometimes some of these, are more dominant than others, but these are kind of three things that we're looking for every time we read something out of the Gospels. What we're going to do now is just talk through a little bit, kind of the basics of the four Gospels. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to start here with, I don't know if anybody knows where these images are from. Does anybody recognize these from?
Are they in the chapel?
I'll give you,
Yeah,
they are from the chapel. So it's a funny, I had to take multiple pictures and have now like kind of cropped it back together. So it's a little bit weird looking, but the chapel here, the doors, have those two curved handles. And these are the four bronze carvings around the handles into the main entrance of the chapel. And they represent the four Gospels. So you can see here Matthew is the angel, the lion for Mark, Luke as the bull, and the eagle for John. So in a lot of places you'll see this iconography for the Gospels. We don't have it a lot here, but it is really beautiful and striking on the chapel doors. And now that we've opened the chapel for twice a week, you can come when it'll be relatively empty, and you can come for prayer. You can all come and pray in the chapel and look at these four gospel images that are carved there into the doors. So we do just have four Gospels. So let's talk a little bit about how we got the Gospels that we have. So um, I think we've talked about this a little bit last year when we went through the whole Bible, but the Gospels have these names attributed to them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and some of those are connected to the names that also were had by the disciples, the apostles. But we know that they were likely written, maybe one generation after the life of Christ. And we'll get into some of those dates in just a few slides. But, it was towards the end of the second century that the church said, okay, there are actually a lot of these writings that we need to figure out which of them are we going to consider authoritative for us as Orthodox Christians. And so, in that process, they kind of had three questions that they looked at as they looked at different options that were out there. If any of you took the class that Josh taught back in the spring on Sundays on the Gnostic Gospels, you'll know that there were all different kinds of writings that were being written into the second and third centuries that told stories of Jesus, but were a little bit off of maybe Orthodox Christianity, or began to sort of veer off into more theology and less of the historical stories of Jesus. So, what these early Christian fathers did is they asked these three questions: how old do we think a particular gospel is? How connected do we feel like it is to the first apostles, the first disciples of Jesus? And how widely accepted is this particular gospel among Christian congregations? Who's considering this authoritative? And so that's how they got to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I taught a class many, many years ago on the Da Vinci Code, and like all that, that brought up for everybody, and everybody who didn't know there were other ancient stories of Jesus. And so maybe I'll revisit that at some point. But, there were other writings of Jesus, but it was already in the late second century that it was really solidified that these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were the ones that the church considered authoritative. It wasn't until 367 that actually became official. But the church really leading up to that point was already considering these four gospels to be the most authoritative. Okay, but the thing that's interesting about that is we can say, well, these are the most orthodox, and yet when you actually wind up looking at them together, and that's what we're going to do throughout this year, is they're actually very different. So that's the fun part about the Gospels, right? Is that you can say, they provide at one moment a very unified story and kind of theological understanding of who Jesus was and is for us today, but also very widely in the things that they think are most important about who Jesus was, the stories that they prioritize, the language that they use. So you have this great combination of both kind of unity and diversity when you look at all the Gospels together. So I'm going to give my colleague Rachel credit for a bunch of the things that you're about to see. Rachel actually sat down and created this pie chart to let you know how the Gospels are all broken up. So really the Gospels all follow a pretty typical, even though John is radically different from the others, they all include all of these kind of things. So birth stories, stories of Jesus' baptism and temptation, stories of Jesus calling his disciples, a huge, sort of collection of stories of his teaching and traveling, his miracles, all these kinds of acts that he did when he was living on earth. And then really move into him coming into Jerusalem, his arrest, his passion, his death, and his resurrection. So, like you can see in that pie chart, right, the amount of gospel material on Jesus' teachings and the amount of gospel material just on that 1 week of his life are pretty comparable, right? So it's interesting the way that time moves in the Gospels. In some ways, it moves very slowly and covers the 3 years of his public ministry, and then has a huge portion at the end that just covers that last week of his life. So this is a way that Rachel sort of talks to confirmation students about what's in the Gospels. So let's look at these four Gospels together or separately, one at a time. So here is Mark with his lion. Now, Rachel will tell you that the lion is the symbol for the Gospel of Mark because it's Jesus Christ's leadership and royal power symbolized in the lion. That is not what Egyptians will tell you, because Mark is the patron saint of Egypt and the early Christian community in Egypt. They will tell you that Mark was martyred in Alexandria, and that prior to his martyrdom, he wrote his gospel by walking out into the desert and writing the gospel from start to finish, and was guarded by a lion. He was protected by a lion while he wrote the gospel, and for them, that is why the lion is the symbol of the Gospel of Mark. So some of you have probably been to Venice, right? And the cathedral, St. Mark's Cathedral in the square in Venice, right? Where they claim to have the relics of the Apostle Mark. And so if you go to Egypt, they will tell you that they have the relics there. And there's a whole debate about, whether the Venetians stole them from Egypt and when they got them back and all that. But when we lived in Egypt, Mark was sort of there, is absolutely the patron saint of the Coptic Orthodox Church. The things that we especially think about when we think about the Gospel of Mark is both that it was likely the earliest of the four Gospels written, and it is also the shortest. And those two things kind of go hand in hand, that as people continued to write these gospel stories, they kept expounding on the stories of Jesus and adding to it. You're much more likely to add as things get older than take away. So when you read the Gospel of Mark, if you read Mark from beginning to end, which I used to have my confirmation students do, it seems like Jesus is always in a hurry to get somewhere. Every transition from one story in the Gospel of Mark to the next story, always the transitioning phrase that they use is, and Jesus immediately went to this place, and he did this thing, and then he immediately went somewhere else. And so there is a forward movement in the Gospel of Mark that you don't get as much in the other Gospels. Some people think that the Gospel of Mark actually was a sermon, kind of written that in a way that we might think about, like the Iliad, would have been kind of recited, right? That we think about that kind of epic poetry. That some people think that the Gospel of Mark, it would have been that evangelists would have traveled around to early churches and would have preached the Gospel of Mark to communities, and that's how people received the story of Jesus. There are some people now today, like I know some Mark scholars who memorize the Gospel of Mark and do that very thing. They go and they kind of recite the Gospel of Mark somewhere. If you're going to start from scratch and read a Gospel, Mark is a great one to read. It's the one that I used to have my confirmation students read, and I had a student come in one time after reading the Gospel of Mark, and the first thing she said before we even started confirmation class was, how come you never told me Jesus was such a jerk? You know? And you kind of get that vibe in Mark, like he does not have time for anyone. He is going from here to there, and so we often, when we read the Gospels in little bits and bites, right, it's very easy to kind of paint the picture of Jesus that we want. And so when you read in a Gospel in its entirety, you get much more of this kind of arc of Jesus' personality, which isn't always warm and fuzzy, by the way. So, so this is the Gospel of Mark. It's also unique that it does not have any birth narrative to it. So it just starts right off with Jesus' public ministry and his baptism. Okay? Just a reminder, you get to stop me anytime you want to ask me a question or disagree with me. So, the next one we're going to look at is Matthew. So Matthew actually comes first in the Bible, right? So it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We think probably the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written around the same time as each other. And likely both Matthew and Luke probably had a copy of Mark sitting in front of them when they wrote their own Gospels, right? Because there's so much repeated material from Mark in Matthew and Luke. Sometimes we talk about Matthew as the church's gospel, interestingly, so it's a little bit anachronistic, right? So in the Gospel of Matthew, there is language about the church, and the church, this is what's important to the church, and they kind of talk about the church, but the church wasn't a thing, right? When Jesus was teaching. But there's this sort of talk about, what does this mean for the church, and what is the calling of the church to do? So, but it's very much kind of, it's really about kind of a community gospel, and really is written from a perspective of Jewish customs and Jewish texts. Okay.
If you could
and probably go ahead. Who's talking?
Me, I was just going to ask. You sort of just did it, but for each one, what was the audience that they were writing to?
Yeah. So for sure, for Mark, it would have been a Jewish audience. Whereas Luke is written much more towards a Gentile audience. So what did Rachel say about, she doesn't. So we don't, thanks Rachel. So she doesn't in this infographic tell us. I mean, I think this is my plug for the class that Josh is teaching right now on Sunday mornings about the parallel development of Christianity and first century Judaism. And so, it's not easy. I mean, we tend to say now, oh, well, this is Christian and this is Jewish. And, Jesus was Christian and his disciples were Christian, but it really wasn't until into the second century that, there was a clear distinction between Christians and Jews, and, that people were practicing both. And, it's just a little bit complicated, but it's pretty clear, Matthew cites more Old Testament texts than any other, and so there's a sense that it's writing more for a Jewish audience than Luke would be. So especially, like, one of the differences, I wish I should have done a slide so you had Matthew and Luke right next to each other, but like when you look at, she doesn't mention this here, but like Luke in his genealogy of Jesus takes the genealogy of Jesus all the way back to Adam, whereas the genealogy of Jesus that's in Matthew just goes back to Abraham. So some people will say, see, Luke's trying to make a connection to sort of all of humanity, and so it's more open to those outside of the Jewish tradition, whereas Matthew is really trying to help them understand Jesus as the inheritor of the tradition of the patriarchs and the sort of Davidic line in that way as well. So the Gospel of Luke is interesting. The Gospel of Luke actually talks about who it's being written for. Sometimes we call Luke the historian. He talks at the beginning about wanting to have a very clear, historically accurate accounting of, you can see she's written here, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus to people that were outside of the Jewish tradition. And so he dedicates the gospel at the beginning to sort of this probably not real person whose name now is not coming into my brain, but in English it would mean lover of God. And so, it's sort of him wanting to set out, to say, you may have read other gospels, but I'm going to write down the real and true gospel. So also, go ahead.
No, is that Theophilus or something?
Oh yeah, Theophilus, lover of God. Thank you, Phoebe.
Okay.
Phoebe is my co-teacher.
No, no.
No, you all know that I always appreciate the help. So Luke has more stories of women than any of the other gospels. It's in Luke where you get the stories of Elizabeth in the birth narratives, the story of the Annunciation. There's a lot more just stories and parables about women in the Gospel of Luke than any of the other Gospels, and there are also more parables in the Gospel of Luke than any of the other Gospels. So one of the things that we can kind of think about, so I just mentioned that probably Mark was written before Luke and Matthew, and that probably Luke and Matthew had a copy of Mark in front of them when they wrote their Gospels. I should have had a slide for this. There is some material that all three of them have the same. And there's some material that just Mark and Luke have, and some materials that just Mark and Matthew have. There's some material that just Luke has, and some that just Matthew has. And all of those seem all pretty reasonable. People get anxious when there is stuff that Luke and Matthew both have and Mark doesn't have. And so some scholars have different theories for why that is. Some people think, if you're going with the kind of Occam's razor, the sort of what is the most reasonable possibility of what happened is that Matthew and Luke weren't written simultaneously. One or the other of them were written first, and one of them had a copy of the other. And so they just have some common material. Some other people think that it's possible that there is an even older source material that we just don't have a copy of anymore, so that there would have been sort of another gospel that was mostly made up of sayings that would have been kind of the earliest kind of teachings and sayings of Jesus, and that Matthew and Luke would have had a copy of that. And that's what they used. And so, but we don't know what that is. And so many people spend their careers trying to figure that out, but it's not really very important. So let me just sort of dismiss an entire field of biblical studies in one fell swoop. It's probably not that important. Um, but when we talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, we talk about them as the synoptic gospels because it's pretty easy, and you can get a whole Bible that does this, that actually has just 3 columns in it, and you can see those 3 gospels kind of follow almost an identical timeline of events. That they kind of are they tell the story in parallel, and so we call them the synoptics because that means to see together, that you can actually look at them all together and they all look kind of the same in some ways. So that takes us to our 4th gospel, the Gospel of John, which is totally, off the rails in that respect. So there is some shared material in John, as opposed, from the other 3 gospels. But, when you buy this synoptic God, like you buy this Gospel Parallels that has the columns in it, there's a column for John, but more often than not, it's empty. And then you flip 4 pages, and then you just have 10 pages of John with nothing in Matthew, Mark, and Luke until you get back to the synoptics. So there are some overlaps, especially when it comes to the stories in Holy Week and some of the teachings, but there are so many unique teachings in the Gospel of John, like you can see in this slide, all those statements about Jesus saying, I am the bread of life, and I am the vine, and you are the branches. All those I am statements. I am the good shepherd. The shepherd knows his sheep. Those all are only found in the Gospel of John. So to answer Phoebe's question about, who are these Gospels written to, one of the things that we especially think we know about the community that John was writing to is that he was most likely writing to an early Christian community that was experiencing persecution. And one of the reasons that we think that is because we know, first of all, that early Christian communities sometimes, experienced some of that. But John has a lot of what we would describe as sectarian language in his gospel. So, for example, if we just threw out the Gospel of John, we would not have any of the language about I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. That teaching of Jesus is only in the Gospel of John. And so what we think probably was going on is that this is an early Christian community that needs to be assured that they have made a good decision. Right? That this is the way and the truth and the life. That this is what it means to be people of faith, and the world outside of us may be putting us in danger, but we want to assure you that you are chosen, and that this is the way. A lot of the exclusivist language that we maybe think of when we think of Christianity or the teachings in the New Testament mostly come from the Gospel of John. That being said, the Gospel of John is really just absolutely beautiful gospel, and has just extended sermons and really beautiful pieces. And some things that, for example, it's only in the Gospel of John that we have the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. There are just some really iconic pieces in the Gospel of John that we wouldn't want to be without. But it's fascinating to think about the fact that, John could be so different from the other 3 Gospels, and yet in that process of bringing it into the canon, that it still was included in that way. And it just sort of speaks to the way that people connected with its message of sort of reassurance and confidence in what it means to be a disciple of Christ. So that is like the fastest version you'll ever hear of the 4 Gospels. Okay, so what we're going to be doing throughout. I'm going to take you back to this one. What we're going to do throughout these few months is talk about. I'm going to actually stop sharing for a little bit. And then we're going to whip through some other stuff really quickly. What we're going to do each month is kind of talk about, we're going to do things kind of topically, right? So that we're able to say, and I'm going to show you on the website where you can find those kind of things. But next time we're just going to talk about beginnings and how does each gospel begin. We're going to do one where we just talk about who were the disciples and how do we understand, the role of the disciples in the gospels. How do we relate to the disciples, right? Like often when we read gospel stories, you find people really identifying with Jesus. They're like, yeah, like in this story, I am Jesus, right? No, you are the stupid disciple. So we're going to talk about the disciples and sort of how are they portrayed and what is the significance of them. We're going to look at women in the Gospels. We're going to look at miracles and parables, and then the stories of Jesus' passion and death and resurrection. So each time we're going to talk about each of those pieces as how they're presented in all four of the Gospels. So we won't do a whole day just on one of the Gospels. So that's why I wanted to just give you a little bit of a snapshot of each of them before we go on. So I'm going to see if anybody has questions before I give you one last pep talk about what we're going to do. I'm trying to give you as much information as humanly possible, and I promise that every other time we meet, we'll have more conversation on this. So this is really me getting you ready to go. Okay, so the last thing that I kind of wanted to talk about is, let me share these screens again, is how as we go through each of these, there are different things. I already talked about this, the narrative and the theology and the practical sort of praxis of what it means for us and how we live as Christians today. These sort of three aspects that we'll weave together every time we look at these passages. But there are also some other things that we will just be we look at these passages. One of them have great pictures for us to look at, and the others I'm just going to talk to you, so that'll be great. So the first one is that especially biblical geography is a little bit overwhelming, but when you just get down to gospel geography, it's not quite as overwhelming as the rest of this. So I'll bring in some more maps for you, and when we look at stories, we'll look at where they're taking place. But, often the way that the gospel writers tell these stories is related to where Jesus is when the stories are being told. So the image on the left, represents at least one of his kind of journeys around sort of the area where he's moving from Galilee to Judea. So Galilee being part of the northern part of Israel and Judea being the south. So the thing that we remember about Jesus is that Jesus was from Nazareth, which is in the north, right? So he's a Galilean peasant. But Jerusalem is where all the action happens in the end. And so for some gospels, the whole gospel is pointing Jesus towards Jerusalem, and he doesn't get there until Holy Week. In other gospels, Jesus is in and out of Jerusalem all the time. And so it's interesting the ways that because one of the things, especially we know about him, is that he was an itinerant teacher. So we're going to look at the places where he is. I have that other little inset as well, because there are some scholars that pay really close attention to just his movements around the Sea of Galilee. Because when he's on the west side of Galilee, he is in Jewish territory, and when he's on the right side of the Sea of Galilee, he's in Gentile territory. And so different things happen on different sides of the sea, and crossing the sea and being around the sea have different significance as stories are being told. So we're going to look a little bit about that. I am by no means an expert in it. So we'll just pay attention. So it's just one of the things to kind of pay attention to when we look at some of these stories. So for example, next month, when we talk about Jesus' birth stories, right, what do we know? That his family had to travel all the way from Nazareth in the north down to Bethlehem in the south for him to be born. So we'll do more with maps a little bit as well because they're fun. So um, these are the other things that we're just going to pay attention to as we go throughout all these stories, right? Because sometimes we can read anything in the Bible, right, and want it to just fit with our particular context. But we keep in mind that, we're reading all of these in a variety of contexts. So we're reading it in a very specific religious context. And so the context of what we call Second Temple Judaism that was happening in the first century, but then also the development of rabbinic Judaism. So the thing that is fascinating is that we also consider Jesus to be a rabbi, a teacher who's going around and seemingly doing really radically creative things with the Old Testament law. And it turns out actually other, Jewish rabbis at the time were doing the same things, right? So it's possible Jesus of Nazareth was not the first person to say you should love God and love your neighbor, because we see that in other early rabbinic teachings, or first century rabbinic teachings. But we do pay very close attention to that, because we know that in Jesus' life that he is coming into conflict with the religious authorities. He is interpreting Jewish tradition and interpreting how people are to follow religious laws. So we pay attention to that and pay attention to, well, I'll talk about this in just a second. The last thing we have to pay attention to. So we also pay attention when we're reading these stories to the political realities that are surrounding Jesus, right? Because he is living in a very specific moment in history. He is also living within a particular political context. So he is living not just in Palestine in the first century, he's living in occupied Palestine. So he's both interacting with the religious authority, but then also with the Roman authority and with the Jewish secular authority as well. So, Jesus has interactions with Roman soldiers, obviously a lot of interactions with Romans at the end of his life. And so we pay attention to what does that mean? How do we understand some of his teachings in light of the political context that he's in? And we pay attention to the culture, right? And so there are some pieces of the Gospels that don't make any sense to us. There's a lot of the Gospels that don't make any sense, but there are some pieces that don't make sense because they are so culturally nuanced. If we don't pay attention to what culturally is going on there, then that we wouldn't be able to kind of understand what the first hearers were supposed to be thinking, right? So I'll mention that every so often, like what would the first hearers of this story have understood Matthew to be trying to say here? There's a really wonderful scholar called Ken Bailey. He's passed away now, but he grew up as a missionary kid in the Middle East and became a New Testament scholar and has written this great work called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. And so he did that in the mid-20th century, and it was sort of this first moment where Western biblical scholars finally said, oh, like there are actually Middle Eastern cultural pieces that we need to take into account as we interpret, these scriptural texts. And so because of his actual knowledge of modern Middle Eastern culture, he kind of brought some of those in. So I'll bring those up when we get to them, especially, that comes into play sometimes, especially when we read the parables and try to understand the culture there. And then finally, the other thing that we pay attention to when we read all these stories, and we'll talk about this each time, is also the history of interpretation of any of these passages, right? Because even though we as modern people sit down with Scripture and we believe that the Spirit of God moves within us and within the Scripture to reveal something to us in that moment, that the Scripture is illuminated to us as modern people, we also are inheritors of some historic interpretations of these passages as well. And so sometimes we'll look at a scriptural text today and kind of see it in fresh eyes, but also need to wrestle with how it's been interpreted in the past. So we'll especially talk about that when we do the session on women in the New Testament and say, how have some of these women been interpreted in the past? How do we interpret them today? So it's interesting. You can look, back at how did Martin Luther interpret this? How did John Calvin interpret this? How did, the early church fathers interpret this? How did, late 20th century scholars interpret this? So that sometimes we inherit an interpretation of a story that we need to acknowledge and then maybe shake off a little bit. The last thing that I want us just to, I'm going to click this. I should not have made this so delayed in showing it to you. So the last thing that I just wanted us to touch on, because there's not, sometimes when we do this class, we have a textbook that we use or like another scholar's work. We're not doing that this time. We're just going to read scripture in preparation. So I think I mentioned maybe in at least some email I sent out at some point that if you are in need of a new Bible or a Bible or anything like that, come to me. We just busted open that storage shed that was in Fisher's Lot where Rachel had been hiding all the Bibles for the past year. And so turns out we have too many. So if you need a Bible, just let me know and you can come by and pick one up. I have here highlighted the New Revised Standard Version, just because that's the version that we teach and preach from typically here. But any one of these translations of the Bible would be great to bring to this class. And sometimes that's the best way to do creative interpretation, especially because we will not be reading anything in the original Greek or Hebrew. And so it's nice sometimes to have multiple translations, and then you can compare how does one translator translate something versus another. So I guess I might strongly encourage you to use at least the New King James Version if you want to use the King James Version. But all the rest of these are pretty typical. We use the NRSV, but I would say sort of my next choice for anybody would be the NIV, the New International Version. But these are kind of standard. I don't know if anybody has the Common English Bible, which is an even newer translation. They're actually in the midst of doing a revision to the New Revised Standard Version. I have no idea what they're going to call it, or I think I knew what they were going to call it. They're doing an update to the NRSV soon, I guess. So we'll see how that goes.